This cataclysmic blast triggered a radioactive tsunami, attracting a record number of spectators in nuclear testing history. However, technological glitches sometimes jeopardize hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. For instance, when atomic bombs fell upon North Carolina, and these are just a few of the most extraordinary nuclear explosions captured on camera. A nuclear explosion is commonly associated with a mushroom-shaped cloud on Earth's surface, but tests were also conducted underwater quite often with ghastly consequences. In 1958, a reckless atomic bomb detonation nearly sank an American submarine. Military personnel had been preparing for these tests for several months. The underwater detonation, code-named Wahoo, took place near the Inuit Tanka Atoll in the Pacific Ocean at a depth of 50 meters. They planted a nuclear device with a yield of 9 kilotons, barely half the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. To gauge the impact of such a relatively small underwater explosion on a naval fleet, testers set up special targets: 3 destroyers, a merchant ship, and a submarine. In the first few seconds following the detonation, a dome of splashes soared to an astounding height of 260 meters. Within 7 seconds, its width expanded to 12,200 meters before slowly dissipating 3 minutes later. These results far exceeded expectations. A vessel anchored almost 5.5 kilometers away trembled violently from the impact waves that damaged its hull, and yet surprisingly, the greatest peril was waiting beneath the water's surface. 3 huge waves triggered by the nuclear detonation hit the submarine one by one. All light bulbs shattered, and the power cord of the device recording conversations in the control room darted out of the socket. When the submarine was finally located, the rescue compartments were inexplicably filled with seawater. But what stunned the military the most was the complete failure of the state-of-the-art fire control system. In a real battle scenario, the submarine and its entire crew would have certainly died. Despite severe vessel damage, radiation contamination remained within projected limits, so it was decided to continue underwater testing. This almost led to a true catastrophe. On June 9, 1958, military personnel resumed testing in the Aniuetak Atoll Lagoon, only to endanger their own lives during the hardtack umbrella test. A nuclear bomb with a yield of 8 kilotons, which made it less destructive than the one used in the Wahoo test, was placed in shallow waters, anchored at a depth of 46 meters not far from the seabed. In the meantime, previously repaired ships and submarines were positioned closer to the lagoon, yet nobody expected the new explosion to be so immensely powerful. For a full 25 minutes after the detonation, a water column hovered 1,500 meters above the surface, spanning almost 2 kilometers in width. At the lagoon's floor, a crater stretching over 6 meters down appeared. Radioactive waves damaged one of the ships so much that it was pointless to even try repairing it. The submarine nearly surfaced, and once again water was detected in its rescue compartments. However, this time the cause of the leak became apparent. Following the high-pressure shock wave, a low-pressure wave ensued. It forcefully opened the hatches and allowed seawater to rush inside the submarine. But the most unforgettable experience awaited those standing on the shore during the test. Soon after the detonation, colossal waves surged upon the island, swallowing it completely. The people there had no choice but to seek refuge in tall trees and stay there until the water receded. Fortunately, nobody got badly hurt. They escaped with slight shock and fatigue and miraculously avoided radiation exposure. Meanwhile, witnesses of the following experiment were less fortunate. This underwater nuclear explosion was so powerful that it caused a real tsunami. In July of 1946, during the Baker underwater nuclear test, a device with a yield of 23 kilotons went off in the Pacific Ocean. This surpassed the destructive force of the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. 16 military vessels were strategically positioned at various distances from the presumed epicenter, aiming to investigate the effects of the detonation. This time they also carried experimental animal subjects, pigs and rats. The explosion occurred at a depth of 27 meters, and within a split second, a superheated gas bubble rapidly expanded both upward and downward. A crater 9 meters deep and over 600 meters wide formed on the seabed. The shock wave erupted like a geyser, releasing a hollow water column that was later named a Wilson cloud. As it expanded, the gas bubble captured everything within a radius of 152 meters and eventually launched 2 million tons of water and sand into the air at 762 meters per second. According to laws of physics, this gigantic column, standing around 1,800 meters tall, was bound to inevitably collapse back down. This phenomenon triggered a tsunami that tossed the military vessels around as if they were made of paper. Merely 12 seconds after the detonation, all the ships involved in the test were stranded on Bikini Atoll, buried under sand, and irrevocably contaminated with radiation. The entire lagoon also got severely polluted as well. Days after the detonation, sailors climbed aboard the least damaged ships to examine the effects of radiation on the experimental animals that were still there. By then, most of the pigs and rats had already perished, but not instantly or because of the shock wave. They'd been dying in slow agony due to the intense gamma radiation dosage. A bit later, when the general public demanded more information on the animals' fate, the military lied that death from radiation was mostly painless so as not to shock civilians. Though in reality, the Pentagon already possessed experimental data on the effects of nuclear testing on human health. Amid the escalating tensions of the Cold War, the US government conducted unique simulations of nuclear explosions in peaceful cities and even broadcast them live to reassure citizens. Under Operation Doorstep, 2 residential houses typical of the 1950s were erected at a Nevada test site. The set included household items, 50 parked cars, and 8 backyard bomb shelters, just as seen in brochures. On top of that, there were mannequins imitating various scenes of daily American life. The objective was to show citizens that even if a nuclear explosion were to occur right on their doorstep, the consequences might not be as terrifying as they imagined. However, things didn't go exactly as planned. On March 17, 1953, a 16-kiloton nuclear bomb was detonated just a kilometer from one of the houses. This marked the first ever live broadcast of a nuclear explosion of such magnitude. The nearest house immediately crumbled into splinters. The second building suffered severe scorching, even though its interiors did survive. But what the blast did to the mannequins inside became a recurring nightmare for many Americans who happened to watch this horror on TV. The dolls were scattered around in unnatural poses, crushed under furniture. Some of their heads were fractured, and their limbs were broken. At the same time, the cars, often used as a symbol of a close-knit, privileged American family, turned into a heap of twisted radioactive metal. Some entrances to bomb shelters were blocked by the rubble, but overall, everything inside them was okay. This demonstration did not reassure American citizens but rather drove them to frantically build shelters for a potential nuclear war. If that wasn't already enough, the military soon orchestrated yet another dreadful test. This time it was much larger in scale as it was supposed to demonstrate the aftermath of an aerial nuclear bombing. At the Nevada test site, they constructed 4 types of residential buildings, a metal stand with concrete blocks, transmission towers, 2 radio antennas, a gas reservoir, a warehouse placed on a concrete platform, and a few cars alongside different utensils. The houses were filled mainly with canned food, and mannequins were placed both inside and outside the buildings to study the light emission. On May 5, 1955, the strength of these structures was tested by detonating a 30-kiloton bomb at a 150-meter-high tower. Just like 2 years before, the whole thing was broadcast live. Around 500 viewers enjoyed the spectacle of a nuclear apocalypse while savoring hot coffee and donuts and occasionally wiping their thick safety goggles. 24 hours after the explosion, military personnel and journalists were allowed to visit the test site to see the devastation firsthand. Brick structures were utterly destroyed, concrete buildings stayed relatively unharmed, but their windows were shattered. Rooms were littered with debris, which inflicted deep cuts on the mannequins. Those placed outside suffered severe scorching. Food supplies proved thoroughly contaminated, canned goods and items wrapped in paper and cellophane received the highest radiation dose. Strangely, even the provisions that avoided direct exposure acquired an unpleasant taste, meaning that someone even dared to sample them later. Power transmission lines were knocked out, with over half of them completely demolished. Once again, the shelters remained intact, reinforcing ordinary Americans' desire to seek refuge underground. However, the military's ultimate goal was to convince the public that any enemy nuclear bombs would never reach U.S. cities. In this extraordinary setting, the Pentagon stationed 5 live officers right under a nuclear detonation. In the 1950s, the U.S. government anticipated that the Soviet Union would attack American cities with a massive fleet of bombers. In return, they developed the Genie, an anti-aircraft missile that also carried a nuclear warhead. The plan was to thwart the atomic attack with a mid-eye nuclear explosion. In this case, what kind of havoc would it wreak on the ground? On July 19, 1957, 5 officers and 1 photographer willingly ventured to the test range. Above their heads, a plane released a rocket with a 1.5 kiloton nuclear warhead. It detonated right above them at an altitude of 5.5 kilometers. The officers felt a pulsating wave of heat, and then the flash almost blinded them despite their protective eyewear. The sound of the shockwave and intense ground vibrations followed. The officers posed for the camera and departed. However, did the radiation leave them entirely unscathed? After thorough medical examinations, it turned out that the person who suffered the most from the radiation was the fighter jet pilot who launched the missile. In turn, all 5 officers and the cameraman were standing far enough from the warhead for the atmosphere to absorb nearly all of the radiation. 2 participants in this experiment lived for almost 40 more years, and others even longer. George Yoshitake, the cameraman, and Major Don Luttrell even reunited in 2012 to celebrate the 55th anniversary of that shoot. They were incredibly lucky that the demonstration of the harmlessness of a nuclear explosion went exactly as planned. However, not all atomic tests could be restrained within acceptable limits. Nuclear experiments that spiraled out of control became a living hell not only for the military. Soviet scientists wanted to conquer nature with the atom, but the price they had to pay was brutal. In 1962, they started wondering if underground nuclear explosions could be useful for fracturing rock and conducting large-scale earthworks. For example, if there was a need to quickly create reservoirs in arid regions with minimal cost. However, there was one crucial condition: the explosion should not contaminate the surroundings with radiation. So Soviet scientists developed a special clean charge with minimal residual contamination. After quite promising initial tests, they decided to use the atomic method to create 40 artificial lakes in Kazakhstan. In the Shogan River floodplain, scientists drilled a 178-meter deep hole and placed there an explosive device with a yield of 170 kilotons, almost 9 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And yet, they insisted that this charge was clean because 94% of its energy was generated through thermonuclear fusion reactions that produced no radioactive byproducts. On January 15, 1965, the explosion created an inferno of gas rising almost 5 kilometers high. 100 million tons of soil soared nearly a kilometer high before cascading down and blocking the riverbed. As a result, a crater was formed, descending 100 meters deep and reaching 430 meters in diameter. Once everything settled down, engineers dug a canal to allow water to fill the new lake. Before long, people were swimming in it, while hundreds of species of fish, mollusks, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and algae thrived in its depths. Although most of the flourishing biodiversity soon died, leaving only heavily mutated remnants. Residents from the nearby villages and cities began reporting thyroid-related illnesses. Apparently, scientists had miscalculated something, and some of the radioactive substances meant to undergo reaction were instead released into the surroundings. Soviet newspapers, however, highlighted only the beauty of the new lake with its pristine water, deliberately ignoring the danger posed to locals. In reality, the contamination of Lake Shogan and territories around it still exceeds permissible limits by almost 100-fold. To this day, it stands as the most radioactive lake in the world. Yet the US government was equally remiss in handling nuclear bombs. For years, the Pentagon guarded a dark secret. American pilots dropped 2 armed thermonuclear bombs over North Carolina in January of 1961. Billy Reeves was just 17 years old. It was an ordinary evening, but an incredibly bright flash suddenly caught his attention. Curiosity drove him to rush outside, and what he saw there haunted him forever. That day, a military plane passed over his serene native town of Goldsboro. The ground was burning, the boy's mother was standing beside him praying, and the sky lit up like doomsday. By the next morning, the military arrived, issuing urgent orders for everyone to evacuate. The B-52 aircraft soared over Goldsboro carrying 2 thermonuclear bombs, each yielding almost 4 megatons of power, which is equivalent to 260 Hiroshimas. The town's unsuspecting residents were completely unaware that since the early 60s, these ominous planes had been flying over their heads regularly. On that particular day, one of those B-52s took off from a military base hidden amidst the woods, serving as a refueling station. As the pilot noticed that the wing was on fire, he started flying in circles to use up some of his fuel before an emergency landing. However, the aircraft disintegrated mid-air, plunging along with its lethal cargo. That was what Billy Reeve saw when he leapt out of bed in the middle of the night, blinded by the flash. Both nuclear bombs also fell down on Goldsboro, but miraculously a parachute was deployed for one of them. As a result, it got entangled in a tree and spared the town from destruction. The military promptly found it, but the moment they saw how damaged the warhead was, local residents were ordered to evacuate immediately. It turned out that a malfunction during the aircraft's fire dislodged the arming pin of the bomb, so it was set to detonate upon approaching the ground. Even the safety mechanisms were not expected to help, however, one of them miraculously glitched and didn't switch to the arm position. This lucky twist of fate saved North Carolina from a nuclear catastrophe. In any other case, everything alive would have been instantly killed within a 27 kilometers radius. That's nearly the area inside the Capitol Beltway that encircles Washington. As for the second bomb, it slammed into the ground at a tremendous speed, then disintegrated into fragments and sank into the marshy soil. All attempts to retrieve it failed, leaving the tritium reservoir and plutonium core resting somewhere in the swamps of North Carolina. Up to this day, we can only hope that if the ground shifts, this won't lead to a new disaster able to turn the state into a radioactive wasteland. However, these 4 megaton bombs are not the only objects that rained down on Americans as a result of nuclear testing. One of the least known tests unexpectedly triggered an entire cosmic storm. On July 9, 1962, a nuclear warhead with the explosive yield of nearly 1.5 megatons was launched from Johnston Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. The military activated it at an altitude of 400 kilometers. Due to the extremely low air density at such heights, instead of the familiar nuclear mushroom cloud, there appeared something like the aurora borealis. But that was just the beginning. In Hawaii, street lights, televisions, radios, and other electrical devices were disabled. Even 3 satellites in orbit were knocked offline. Moreover, 7 other satellites experienced rapid wear and tear on their solar panels and electronics. In total, 1/3 of spacecraft in low orbit at the time of the explosion suffered severe damage. This happened because of an immensely powerful electromagnetic pulse that came along with the detonation. In the aftermath, electrons lingered in the atmosphere for 5 more years, forming a belt that proved dangerous for airplanes. The Pentagon hadn't foreseen such repercussions, so they classified all the details. They became public only partly and only at the turn of the 21st century. But in fact, there are many other nuclear explosions they keep trying to hide from us. Information about some nuclear detonations remains classified to this day. The truth about their outcome is chilling. Governments continue to deny the very existence of these explosions. On September 22, 1979, a Vela satellite that was orbiting Earth recorded an unusual double flash on the border between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The military had seen such images on their monitors many times before. However, this time they didn't hesitate to sound the alarm, as everyone knew there couldn't be any nuclear testing at that location. At that very moment, President Carter called for an emergency meeting at the White House. Amid preparations for his re-election campaign, he wanted no foreign policy troubles on his plate. The main suspects behind the illicit nuclear tests were South Africa and Israel, but Carter was sure that South Africa's nuclear program was poorly developed, and he himself had played a role in freezing it. That left only Israel, which could have used a ship to launch the bomb. Scientists started an investigation, and within a month, physicist and science advisor to the president Frank Press stated that the flashes might have had a non-nuclear explanation. By May of 1980, the case was closed after only 3 meetings. The commission members confidently declared that the event was not a nuclear explosion. They dismissed all evidence contradicting this conclusion. They ignored even the detection of radioactive iodine in Australian sheep's thyroid glands, attributing the whole thing to a minor meteorite impact. Immediately after the verdict, all documents related to the case were classified, and the investigation was halted, probably because Israel was and still is an important partner and ally to the US. So boiling relations with this country isn't the best possible option, is it? By the way, Israel unofficially belongs to the nuclear club, even though it has never announced the development or testing of atomic weapons, although usually governments hide information about nuclear tests for entirely different reasons. This explosion may have annihilated an entire Soviet Army Corps in September of 1954. Exercises were held at the Tokko Range in the Orenburg region to familiarize Soviet soldiers with new tactical approaches. Stalin was hatching plans to conquer Western Europe after Germany's defeat, and the landscapes near Tokko bore a striking resemblance to those of Europe. Commanders were certain that if a new war erupted, nuclear weaponry would definitely be utilized. For the exercises, they prepared the most advanced bomb of that time, code-named RDS-4, also known under the female name Tatiana. At the appointed hour, it detonated at the Tokko Range. The combined explosion yield amounted to 38 kilotons, which was more than the total destructive force unleashed on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The shock wave nearly knocked the soldiers off their feet. Despite this, they received orders to continue the test no matter what. They had no proper radiation protection, only gas masks, to conduct combat operations near a nuclear blast. Although these skills didn't come in handy, according to unofficial data, almost all exercise participants died from radiation sickness shortly after that. A total of 45,000 military personnel were involved in the maneuvers at the Tokko Range. Surviving witnesses were coerced into silence, and their personal documents were falsified. As a result, on the day of the tests, all of them were officially staying in different parts of the Soviet Union. The classified information about the Tokko tragedy started to leak only after the collapse of the USSR. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only country that tried to deny conducting such cruel experiments on its own people. These American tests inflicted the most harm on civilian populations. The most intensive series of nuclear tests took place in 1957. Over the course of a year, 29 large-scale nuclear explosions were conducted on the continental part of the United States. For a long time, the data about these tests remained secret. That's hardly surprising. After all, the military wanted not only to enhance their anti-aircraft and anti-submarine warfare but also gain a more comprehensive understanding of the effects of radiation on living organisms. At first, experiments were carried out on animals. Pigs were dressed in protective suits and placed in cells at varying distances from the explosion's epicenter to determine which material offered better protection against the thermal pulse. The majority of the animals eventually died of massive burns. In another experiment, pigs were placed behind glass panels to study the behavior of window fragments during an atomic blast. Approximately 2,000 pigs were involved in these horrifying tests. It's scary to even imagine the atmosphere and the agonizing cries of the wounded animals, but the experimenters did not stop there. Humans were next in line. The physical and psychological effects of tactical nuclear combat were tested on soldiers of the US Army. In total, more than 16,000 servicemen participated in these exercises. To this day, it remains the largest confirmed military maneuver in history involving the use of nuclear weapons. What's worse, for many years after the tests, veterans sought medical assistance and couldn't get any because their insurance didn't cover exotic forms of cancer. Besides, technically they were irradiated during peacetime, meaning they weren't entitled to disability compensation. Apart from the usual leukemia, atomic veterans were diagnosed with 8 rare forms of cancer and even genetic damage. In the 1970s, atomic veterans founded a movement to fight the concealment of the effects of nuclear experiments on humans and to get medical benefits. However, the most controversial record of the entire test series, Operation Plum Bob, is associated with civilians. These explosions account for a third of all the harmful radiation from all continental nuclear tests in the United States. Over 4 months, more than 58,000 kilocuries of radioactive iodine were released into the atmosphere. This led to thousands of documented cases of thyroid cancer. According to estimations from the National Cancer Institute, between 10,000 and 75,000 cases were rooted in the events of the Nevada test site. In 2006, American scientists published a report stating that 22,000 cancer cases were linked to radiation exposure, and there were 2,000 leukemia-related deaths. However, the US government still refuses to acknowledge responsibility for these consequences. It's a paradox. The tests themselves are no longer classified, yet everyone pretends they never happened. But perhaps not only Earth is tainted with the byproducts of the atomic age. In 2018, while analyzing samples collected by the Curiosity rover on Mars, NASA scientists discovered that the red planet's atmosphere bears a strange resemblance to that of Earth. There were xenon isotopes which, on our planet, appear only after hydrogen bomb tests. A bit later, physicist John Brandenburg proposed the hypothesis that Mars might have experienced a large-scale nuclear war hundreds of millions of years ago. This would mean that it once hosted a developed civilization that self-destructed from nuclear conflict. Either way, do you believe we may someday meet a similar fate?